The morning sun hung low over the quiet old American town, casting long shadows across the dusty road that led straight to the small wooden church. Folks had gathered early, filling the benches and the open yard, whispering to one another about the wedding everyone expected would be simple and peaceful. But even in a place where life moved slow and silence felt normal, there were moments that carried a heaviness no one could ignore. That morning was one of those moments. The scent of prairie dust, horse sweat, and wild sage filled the air, yet something felt off right from the start. People watched every shift of the church doors, waiting for the groom to show himself, waiting for the moment the bride would step out and walk toward the altar where she believed her life was about to begin. She stood inside the wooden doorway in her white dress, clutching a small bouquet with trembling hands. Her dress had taken her months to sew, each stitch done with hope that maybe, for once, life would be kind to someone like her. She was gentle, soft-spoken, and bigger in body than most of the young women in town. Some people judged her for it, whispering behind her back, shaking their heads, wondering how someone with her looks had managed to find a man willing to marry her. She had heard those whispers for years, felt the sting of them, but she had always kept her head down and done her work. Today, she tried to believe that all the hurt would finally fade. Today, she thought she would walk out of that church and find a little piece of happiness waiting, but the church stayed quiet. Too quiet. The groom was nowhere to be seen. Outside, folks exchanged glances, the kind that said they already suspected the truth, but did not want to be the first to speak it. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at the ground. They all knew the man she was supposed to marry cared more about how others saw him than about loyalty or kindness. He had been bragging for weeks about how he was settling, how he deserved better, how he was doing her a favor. Some men laughed with him, some didn't, but no one stepped in to stop the insults. And now, as minutes passed like hours, everyone realized he was not coming. She stepped out of the doorway, her face pale, her eyes searching the road as if the man she loved would appear at any moment. But all that met her eyes was emptiness and heat waves rising off the dirt. Her throat tightened. She could feel the pressure of everyone watching her. Someone tried to offer a soft word. Someone else whispered a prayer. Someone in the back whispered too loudly that the groom probably ran off because he wanted a prettier bride. Each word cut deeper than the last. She held her bouquet to her chest, trying to steady her breathing, trying not to break down. She had spent her whole life fighting to be accepted, to be treated with respect. Now, standing in the middle of the churchyard in her wedding dress, she felt as if every cruel thing ever said about her had been painted across her skin for the whole world to see. She felt abandoned not just by a man, but by hope itself. Just when her knees weakened and she feared she might fall, a distant sound broke through the uneasy silence. The steady beat of hooves came from the edge of town. People turned, shielding their eyes against the sun, trying to make out who was approaching. What they saw brought more whispers, louder ones this time. A lone horse moved toward them, its rider sitting straight, despite the dust covering his body and the fresh wound on his side. His long, dark hair fell over his shoulders, tied loosely with a feather. His skin carried the deep bronze shade of a life lived under the open sky. He wore traditional Apache clothing, torn in places from what looked like a recent struggle. His horse's steps slowed as he neared the churchyard, his strong posture wavering slightly from pain, though he tried not to show it. People backed away, some out of fear, some out of curiosity, some out of prejudice. Apache warriors were rarely seen near town without trouble following close behind. But this man did not hold a weapon. His hands were steady on the reins. His eyes, dark and sharp, searched the yard with purpose, though no one knew what business an Apache would have at a wedding that had already turned into heartbreak. The bride lifted her head, her tears blurring her vision as the rider came closer. She watched him stop just a few yards away, his expression unreadable, but not hostile. He looked at her in a way no one else had looked at her that day. Not with pity, not with judgment, not with mockery. Instead, his gaze held something steady, something quiet and strong, as if he saw past the dress, past her trembling hands, past the humiliation she tried so hard to hide. The townsfolk held their breath as the Apache slid off his horse with a slow and controlled movement despite the injury on his side. He steadied himself, then took a single step toward her. At that moment, the world around her seemed to freeze. She could hear only her heartbeat and the soft creak of the saddle as the horse shifted behind him. No one knew his story. No one knew where he came from or why he carried such deep determination in his eyes. Rumors traveled fast in the old frontier, though. Some whispered that he was wounded, escaping trouble. Others muttered that he must be desperate if he dared step into town. A few believed he must be dangerous. Yet none of those whispers matched the calm presence he carried. He stood in front of her now. It's close enough for her to see the dried blood on his side and the dust clinging to his clothing. She could feel the strength in him, a quiet kind that didn't come from words, but from surviving the hardest parts of life. She tried to wipe her tears, embarrassed he had seen her at her lowest moment. But her hand shook. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked toward the people who were still gathered, their eyes filled with shock and confusion. Afterward he turned his gaze back, toward her, and something in his voice carried both firmness and respect as he spoke. His tone was steady, almost gentle, yet strong enough that everyone heard him. She inhaled sharply, unsure if she had misunderstood. The man who had arrived out of nowhere, wounded and alone, stepped forward in front of the entire town and offered something no one else had even considered. The churchyard went silent. No whispers. No movement. Just stillness. Her hands tightened around the wilted petals of her bouquet. Her heart raced, unsure if she was facing another cruel twist of fate or something she had never imagined possible. She looked into his eyes, trying to understand why a stranger, especially an injured Apache, would step forward at the exact moment when she felt completely broken. Before she could respond, before anyone could question him, a distant rumble echoed from beyond the ridge. Horses, several of them, riders approaching fast. The Apache's jaw tightened. Some townsfolk stepped back with fear. Others grabbed their children. Her breath caught in her chest. Realizing whatever was coming next would change everything, and the question hanging in the air was whether his offer was a moment of mercy, a desperate act, or the beginning of something far bigger than any of them expected. More riders approached from the distance, and she wondered if she should step closer to him or step away. Not knowing which choice would save her life or break her heart, the sound of the approaching riders grew stronger until the ground beneath everyone's feet seemed to tremble. The bride's breath caught as she looked from the injured Apache to the dusty ridge beyond the churchyard. Whatever was coming carried urgency, and the tension wound tighter around the onlookers. Some townsfolk hurried back toward the church steps. Others watched with narrowed eyes, unsure whether they were about to face danger or simply witnessed another moment that would be whispered about for years. The Apache stood still. Though his body leaned slightly to one side from the injury he tried to hide, even in pain, he held a kind of steady strength. His eyes stayed fixed on the approaching riders with the awareness of someone who had lived too many years watching shadows and listening for trouble before it arrived. The bride could see the small rise and fall of his chest, the quiet calculation behind his silence. For a moment she wondered if he was protecting her or using her presence as cover for something else. She did not know him. She did not know his story. Yet she felt that strange pull again, that unspoken feeling that he had stepped toward her for a reason deeper than kindness or chance. The riders appeared over the ridge. 3 figures on horseback, moving in tight formation. Their dust clouds curled behind them like smoke. The people near the churchyard murmured nervously. No one recognized the riders from a distance, but the horses moved with purpose. The bride tightened her grip on her bouquet as the riders slowed, approaching the edge of town. The Apache shifted slightly, keeping her behind the angle of his shoulder. It was subtle, so small the townsfolk barely noticed, but she felt it immediately. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs, unsure whether she should trust him or worry about what he was bringing with him. The riders stopped several yards away. They did not draw weapons, but their faces looked worn by travel and tension. The leader scanned the town, then fixed his gaze directly on the Apache. The bride saw something flicker across the Apache's expression, not fear but a kind of quiet readiness. The leader spoke sharply, his words heavy with distrust. Whatever he said was enough to make a few people whisper to one another again. The Apache did not answer. He stayed silent, breathing slow and steady. The kind of calm that came when a man had learned to stay standing no matter what storm he faced. The bride watched him carefully. She did not understand the words the strangers used, but she understood the weight behind them. The leader's voice carried anger, suspicion, and something personal she could not place. The Apache finally responded in a low voice, his tone firm but without hostility. The conversation was tense, though controlled. The riders seemed unsatisfied. One of them pointed toward the wound on the Apache's side. The bride swallowed hard, realizing he must have been running from something long before he reached town. The riders studied him, their hands resting near their saddles. The air grew heavy again, before the moment could shift into something worse. The riders pulled their horses back, spoke among themselves, and then turned toward the open land, leaving a cloud of dust behind them. It was a warning. They were not finished. Whatever business they had with the Apache would return, and everyone in the yard knew it. Silence fell again. Even the church bell creaked quietly in the wind, as if uncertain how to react. The bride took a slow step forward. Her knees trembled from everything that had happened in the last hour. She wanted to ask him why those riders were after him, why he had arrived bleeding and alone, and why he had stepped toward her in front of the entire town. But her voice felt trapped in her throat. Her shame, her shock, and her confusion tangled inside her until she could not find the right words. The Apache looked at her. Then, with a softness that contrasted everything around them, he seemed to understand her fear even without her speaking it. She noticed how exhausted he looked, how the edges of his strength were frayed. The wound on his side bled through the cloth tied around it. She wondered how long he had been riding, how far he had come, whether he had stopped anywhere for help before arriving at the church. The people around them slowly began to drift apart. Some refused to stand near an Apache. Others pretended to care for her by ushering her away from him, though she could sense the judgment beneath their concern. A few stayed back, watching with wary eyes. She felt caught between two worlds now, one where she was humiliated and abandoned, the other where a stranger, wounded and unwanted by the world, had offered her something unexpected in the middle of her worst moment. The church door stood open behind her, the empty altar waiting like a reminder of what had fallen apart. She thought back to the weeks before the wedding, how the man she was supposed to marry had begun acting distant. She ignored the signs because she wanted to believe in something good. She remembered the little moments she had imagined. Cooking meals together, working the small patch of land outside town, waking up each morning with someone beside her who didn't mock her weight or treat her like an embarrassment. She had dreamt of a life where she didn't have to worry about being judged for her body or spoken to with hidden cruelty. But the truth came crashing down. He never truly wanted her. He wanted praise, attention, and the approval of others. When he realized marrying her would bring more laughter from his friends than respect, he left her standing alone. That realization sank deep into her chest, heavier than anything she had carried before. The Apache watched her with steady eyes. She wondered if he could see her pain as clearly as he saw the dust on the road. She wondered if he understood loss or rejection. His face held the quiet of a man who had endured hardship many times. She felt an unexpected sense of safety near him, even though she didn't know him or what danger followed him. The sun shifted higher, warming the churchyard until the dust sparkled in the air. She wiped the remaining tears from her cheeks and forced herself to breathe. She did not want the town to see her break again. The Apache noticed her struggle and reached into the small pouch at his side. He slowly took out a piece of cloth, offering it to her without stepping too close. She hesitated. She had never been this close to an Apache before, but she accepted it, feeling the rough, warm fabric against her fingers. He spoke again, his voice quiet, telling her something she could not fully understand. But the tone was gentle, and she felt an unexpected ease spread through her chest. For the first time since the morning began, she did not feel completely alone. A few townsfolk murmured in disapproval. They did not want her near him, not after what had just happened. Some believed she had enough problems without tying herself to an injured stranger from a tribe they feared. Others looked at her with pity, convinced she was too desperate or too broken to understand the danger. She was inviting into her life, but she didn't care about their whispers anymore. She had already been judged harshly enough for one lifetime. If anyone had the right to choose who she spoke to or who stood beside her, it was her, not them. She glanced toward the fading dust where the riders had disappeared. They would return. She could feel it. Trouble was not finished with him, and now she wondered if trouble would also sweep her up with it. The air held a strange mix of fear and possibility. Like the moment before a storm when the wind changes direction, the Apache steadied himself, though his legs shook slightly. He gestured toward the road out of town, as if urging her to move before more trouble arrived. She hesitated again. She had just been abandoned at the altar. She had no idea what direction her life was supposed to take now. Leaving with him seemed too sudden, too wild, too dangerous. Yet staying in town meant enduring the whispers, the stares, the cruel jokes that would follow her for months. Her breath caught as she realized. She was standing at a crossroads she had never expected. Two paths stretched out before her. One toward a future she already knew would be painful. The other toward a stranger whose presence stirred something she could not explain, and whose past was about to crash directly into both of their lives before she could make a choice. The distant thunder of hooves echoed. Again, louder, closer, faster than before. She turned toward the sound with her heart pounding. Whatever was coming would not wait for her to decide. Sound of hooves thundered across the open land again, closer than before, sending a ripple of fear through the townsfolk. The bride felt her heart thump wildly as she turned toward the ridge. The Apache beside her stiffened, shifting his stance, as if ready to protect her despite his wound. Dust rose in fast-moving waves, hinting that whoever was coming rode with urgency that carried danger behind it. The people near the church began pulling their children inside. Some men stepped forward instinctively, though they had no real plan besides looking protective. The bride stood frozen for a moment, torn between fear for herself and concern for the man who had stepped between her and humiliation only moments earlier. She looked at him, noticing how tightly he held his injured side. He was in no condition to run or fight, yet his eyes stayed locked on the approaching riders with fierce determination. She whispered to him without thinking, asking if he wanted help or a place to hide. He shook his head with a calm certainty, as if running would only make things worse. She wondered again why the riders were after him, what he carried with him that made them chase him into town, and whether his offer to take her hand had something to do with keeping her or himself safe. The questions kept piling up, each heavier than the last. When the riders finally came into view, there were more than before. 5 this time, riding with the confidence of men who believed the land belonged to them. They slowed only enough to assess the scene. Their leader, a tall man with a sharp jaw and hardened expression, glared straight at the Apache. His stare traveled briefly toward the bride, and she felt a chill rush through her. He recognized something in the situation, something he didn't like. The leader demanded the Apache step forward. His voice echoed off the church walls, making the bride flinch. No one in town dared to interrupt. The churchyard felt trapped between two storms, one emotional and one physical. The Apache did not move at first. He breathed deeply, then finally stepped ahead, placing himself between the riders and the bride. His posture carried both strength and quiet defiance. The leader dismounted, walking with a heavy stride as he approached the Apache. The bride could not understand every word exchanged, but she could read the anger simmering beneath the leader's accusations. He gestured toward the wound, toward the horse, toward the town, as if the Apache's presence here was a crime against the land. The tension rose again, twisting in the air like a tightening rope. Some townsfolk began whispering that the Apache must have done something serious to be hunted so insistently. Others whispered he might be innocent, and these riders were simply men trying to prove their authority. No one truly knew the truth. The bride watched every moment with a growing ache in her chest. She wanted to step forward, to defend him, to say he hadn't harmed anyone here. But she had no idea what story lay behind his weary eyes. The leader demanded something the Apache refused to give. The Apache's voice remained calm, steady, but his refusal made the leader's face twist with frustration. One of the riders gripped his reins tighter, as if considering reaching for a weapon. The bride took a step back, feeling the pressure of the moment closing in around her. Before the conflict erupted, an older man from the town stepped between them, raising his hands. He tried to reason with the riders, telling them the town did not want trouble. The leader barely acknowledged him, brushing off the attempt like a fly. The Apache stood strong, though she saw his knees weaken briefly. He was running out of strength, but pride and duty kept him standing upright. A new wave of whispers spread through the crowd when the leader mentioned a missing item, something he believed the Apache carried. The bride's breath caught. Was that the reason for the chase? Was the Apache accused of stealing something? Or perhaps he had been entrusted with something dangerous? She realized the riders were not simply hunting him out of hatred, but searching for something invisible to the rest of them. That secret held weight, a weight she could sense, even if she didn't know the details. The leader stepped closer to the Apache, lowering his voice in a way only a few nearby could hear. The bride leaned forward slightly, trying to catch even a trace of the words. She couldn't, but she saw the way the Apache's jaw clenched. Whatever the leader threatened, it struck directly at something important. After a tense moment, the leader backed away, signaling his men. They mounted their horses once again, staring down at the Apache as if promising their return. Then they rode off, their dust cloud lingering behind them like a warning. The churchyard exhaled in one slow breath. The riders were gone, but the fear they carried stayed behind. The bride turned to the Apache, who now breathed with noticeable strain. He had held strong, but the confrontation had drained what little strength he had left. She stepped closer, reaching out as he swayed. He didn't want to lean on her, but he had no choice. She caught his arm and helped steady him, her hands shaking but determined. Some townsfolk began to argue quietly among themselves. A few insisted the Apache should be turned over to the riders if they came back, fearing danger for the whole town. Others felt unsure, wanting to understand his story. A very small handful believed they should help him, but none of them stepped forward. They were too scared of the consequences. The bride guided him toward the side of the church, where the shade might help ease the pain in his wound. He lowered himself slowly, bracing against the wall. She knelt beside him, unsure what to say, unsure whether he even wanted her help, but he did not push her away. His breathing slowed, though each inhale seemed to take effort. She tried to ask what happened, why the riders hunted him so fiercely, and whether he had truly done what they accused him of. He looked at her with calm eyes, offering only small pieces of the truth in return. He had been carrying something important, something he had been entrusted with by someone he respected. He refused to give it to the riders because he believed it would bring danger to more than just himself. He said it was not a matter of pride, but duty. And he said he had not come to town to cause trouble. He came seeking safety long enough to heal and protect what he carried. She sensed he was telling the truth. His words held sincerity, not the slippery sound of someone hiding guilt. But she also felt the mystery deepen. Whatever he protected must be powerful, valuable, or connected to something far bigger than she understood. While he rested, she found herself watching the town from behind the church. People wandered away slowly, returning to their daily tasks, though their eyes kept drifting back toward the Apache and the bride. Some watched with concern, others with suspicion. She felt every stare, every whisper, yet this time the shame did not cut her as sharply as before. She knew what it felt like to be judged without mercy. Maybe that was why she felt drawn to help someone else facing the same kind of isolation. Hours passed as the sun climbed higher. She brought him a small amount of water, knowing he needed it more than she did. He accepted it with a quiet nod, though she noticed the way his hands trembled from exhaustion. She wanted to take him somewhere safer than the church wall, but she also knew the town was divided. Some might refuse shelter to an Apache, especially one hunted by armed riders. As the afternoon cooled slightly, tension continued to hang over them. The bride looked toward the road again, half expecting the riders to return sooner than expected. The Apache sensed her worry. He spoke softly, telling her the riders would not give up easily. They believed he carried something they desperately wanted. They would return with more strength next time. That truth struck her hard. She realized helping him meant stepping into danger far beyond her quiet life. She had never imagined facing such a challenge on the very day she was supposed to be married. Yet something inside her refused to walk away. She had spent too many years watching people suffer in silence, including herself. This time she wanted to stand for something, even if she did not fully understand it. As the evening light softened the land, she noticed a few more people gathering near the church. Not riders, but townsfolk. A woman who had always been kind to her approached, offering a small cloth bundle with herbs for the Apache's wound. Another man, older and quiet, handed her a canteen, telling her to use it if the Apache needed more water. It surprised her. Not everyone feared him. Not everyone wanted to push him away, but the support was small, scattered, and uncertain, and the danger still lingered far beyond the edge of town. The Apache looked toward the horizon with a silence that said he was preparing himself. She followed his gaze, wondering what he saw, wondering what future waited for them. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of distant hooves again. This time, it felt like the storm approaching had no intention of passing them by. The faint rumble of hooves in the distance returned like an unwelcome reminder that the peace surrounding the church was never meant to last. The bride froze, her breath tightening as she looked to the injured Apache leaning against the wall. His eyes narrowed, and he listened with the instinct of someone who had learned to hear danger long before it arrived. The wind carried dust across the open land, and the evening sun stretched long golden lines across the dirt road. Everything looked calm, but the tension beneath it felt sharp. The Apache pushed himself straighter, ignoring the pain slicing through his side. She stepped forward as if to keep him from falling, but he lifted a hand gently to show he could stand. It wasn't pride. It was survival. He needed to look strong for whatever was coming, and she understood that. Still, her worry grew heavier, settling deep in her stomach. People near the churchyard heard the hooves too, and a few stepped outside again. They scanned the ridge where the riders had disappeared earlier. The same fear that had filled the town hours before returned, only stronger this time. This visit wouldn't be a warning. This visit felt like something final, something that would force a choice none of them wanted to make. She felt the pull inside her grow. She couldn't leave him alone. Not after everything he had already endured. Not after the way he had stepped between her and the harshness of the world without hesitation. She didn't even understand why he had offered to take her hand, but she knew one thing clearly. His heart carried honor, even if trouble followed close behind him. The hooves grew louder. The Apache looked toward the horizon, but he didn't flinch. He took a slow breath, preparing himself. She realized he had no intention of hiding. Whatever he carried, whatever the riders wanted, he would not let it fall into the wrong hands. His determination carried a strength she admired more than she expected. It made her forget her own heartbreak for a moment and focus fully on the danger creeping closer. A man from town hurried toward them, whispering that the riders weren't alone this time. He had seen dust rising from another direction too. The Apache's jaw tightened at that. He knew they were trying to corner him. The bride's pulse raced as she glanced around. The town was small and open. There were no real hiding places. The church offered little shelter, and the Apache could barely stay upright long enough to run. She wanted to ask him again what the riders wanted, but the question stuck in her throat. She sensed that whatever truth he carried would put her at risk too, and yet she felt herself leaning closer to him, ready to help no matter what. As the rumble of hooves thickened, a strange quiet washed over the land. The birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. The Apache reached behind him and pulled out a small leather pouch tied with a thin strip of hide. She stared at it, sensing its importance. He looked at it with a seriousness that told her everything she needed to know. This was what the riders wanted. He had risked his life to protect it. He tucked it close to his chest again, tightening the knot. She wanted to ask what was inside, but he shook his head slightly, silently urging her not to ask. The weight of trust between them grew heavier and more real. He had something he believed must not fall into the wrong hands, and he was willing to bleed for it. She wondered what kind of man carried that level of responsibility. A man who had been abandoned by his own people, or a man chosen by them for a purpose most would never understand. When he took a shaky step forward, she moved beside him without thinking. She saw him glance at her dress, torn and dusty from the long day. His gaze softened for a moment. She wondered what he thought of her, a woman cast aside only hours earlier, now standing beside a warrior at the edge of danger. She didn't feel weak now. She felt needed, and that gave her strength she didn't know she had. The first group of riders appeared over the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the fading sun. Dust whirled behind them like a storm cloud. The Apache stood taller, though his breath hitched from the effort. She stayed near him, not wanting him to face them alone. The townsfolk stepped back again, forming a loose circle that left her and the Apache exposed. The leader from earlier rode in front again. But this time he wasn't calm. His anger showed clearly. He shouted demands the wind carried across the churchyard. He wanted the pouch. He wanted it now. And he wanted the Apache to surrender without argument. The Apache shook his head calmly. The leader cursed loudly and signaled to his men. 2 riders moved to block the end of the road. 2 more circled around the side of the church. They were closing in, leaving no room for escape. The bride felt her throat tighten as panic pressed in. Even if she wanted to run, there was nowhere to go. But she didn't run. She planted her feet firmly beside the Apache. He noticed. His eyes flicked toward her with something close to gratitude. The tension snapped tighter as one of the riders dismounted and marched forward. He pointed at the Apache's wound and laughed loudly, mocking his weakness. The bride felt anger rise inside her. She hated that people thought wounds were proof of weakness. She hated that this stranger mocked a man who had done nothing but stand strong despite pain. She lifted her chin, surprising even herself. The rider sneered at her, but she didn't back away. Shame had already bruised her heart once today. She refused to let anyone see her as fragile again. The rider turned his attention back to the Apache and demanded the pouch. The Apache remained silent. His steady refusal made the rider's face twist with frustration. He lunged forward, grabbing the Apache's arm. The Apache staggered but stayed upright. The bride instinctively reached to steady him. The rider snapped at her to step back, but she didn't move. The leader barked orders. The riders surrounded them completely now, leaving no open path. The townsfolk watched nervously, afraid to intervene. Even the older man, who offered water earlier, stood frozen, unsure of how to help without risking the entire town. The Apache breathed deeply, his strength fading, but his resolve unbroken. He finally spoke, saying he would never give up what he protected. His voice was strained but clear enough for everyone to hear. It wasn't arrogance. It was duty. The leader's patience snapped. He stepped off his horse, marching forward. He grabbed the pouch tied against the Apache's chest and tried to yank it free. The Apache reacted instantly, gripping the leader's wrist despite the pain. The force of his reaction surprised everyone. Even wounded, he would not let go. The leader shouted for his men to intervene, and the circle grew tighter. The bride hesitated only a heartbeat before moving between them. She raised her voice for the first time all day, telling them to stop. Her voice shook, but she didn't retreat. She stood with her arms out, shielding the Apache as much as she could. Her breath trembled, but the determination in her eyes held firm. The riders looked shocked. The leader stared at her with disbelief. He asked why she defended someone she didn't know. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't have one clear reason. She had many. He had shown her respect when she felt broken. He had stood for her when others mocked her. And now, he carried danger that seemed bigger than both of them, yet he refused to betray whatever trust had been placed in him. She couldn't walk away from that kind of strength. She told the riders he had harmed no one here. She told them he needed help, not threats. Her voice steadied as she spoke, surprising even herself. Before the leader could respond, a second dust cloud appeared in the distance. The one coming from the opposite side of town? The Apache's eyes widened. the riders, turned sharply. The townsfolk fell silent once again. More riders were coming. Not the same group. A different one. And from the way the Apache's breath tightened, she knew this new group was far more dangerous than the first. The leader's men exchanged nervous glances. They had not expected another group. The ground trembled with the force of approaching hooves. The bride felt the air shift around them, the weight of something bigger than any of them pressing down. The Apache steadied himself. Bracing for what was coming, she stayed beside him, her heart pounding. Whatever awaited them next would decide the fate of everyone standing in that quiet frontier town. And the worst part was, the sun was sinking fast, leaving the land wrapped in shadows as the second group rode closer. The second group approached fast, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the fading light. The townsfolk stepped back again, unsure whether to run or stay. The bride felt her heart pound as she glanced at the injured Apache beside her. He pressed a hand to the pouch hidden under his clothing, steadying himself in a way that told her he knew exactly who was coming. The fear in his eyes mixed with something else, something hopeful. As if he had been waiting for this group without knowing whether they would appear in time. The first riders who had threatened him earlier looked tense now. Their leader barked orders for his men to reposition, but uncertainty flashed in their movements. The new riders came in a wider formation, their horses moving with controlled, powerful strides. As they came closer, the bride noticed something different about them. They moved not with the aggressive hunger of men seeking to take something, but with a steady purpose, as if drawn by duty more than force. When they reached the churchyard, they slowed and formed a half-circle that faced the first group of riders. Their own leader stepped forward, a tall man with braided hair, carrying the calm authority of someone who had earned respect through quiet strength rather than fear. His eyes locked onto the injured Apache first, and a deep, relieved breath escaped his chest. The Apache straightened as much as the pain would allow. The bride sensed a connection between the two men, one built on trust that no words needed to explain. The new leader approached him slowly, scanning the wound, then the pouch, then the tense circle of riders around them. He asked the injured Apache something in their own language. The answer came in a tired but steady voice. The leader nodded, understanding instantly. The bride finally understood what the pouch meant. It was not stolen. It was carried with duty, entrusted to the injured Apache by his own people. It held something sacred, something that was never meant to be taken by the men chasing him. Those men had wanted to seize something valuable, something that did not belong to them. That was why they had hunted him so fiercely. The first group of riders shifted uncomfortably as the truth hung in the air. Their leader stepped forward, demanding again that the Apache surrender the pouch. But this time, the new group stood between him and the Apache. Their presence radiated strength rooted not in intimidation, but in unity and purpose. The leader of the second group spoke firmly, telling the first riders they had no right to what they sought. His voice carried an unshakable calm, the kind that silenced even the boldest men. The townsfolk felt the shift instantly. The fear that had hovered for hours slowly eased as the confrontation changed direction. The first riders looked at one another, realizing they no longer had the numbers or the justification to continue. Their leader muttered something under his breath, clearly frustrated, but he had no choice. He signaled his men to retreat. One by one, they mounted their horses again. Before turning to leave, the leader cast a final glare at the bride and the Apache, silent threat he no longer had the power to enforce. Then he rode off with his men trailing behind him, disappearing into the darkening land. The moment they were gone, the weight in the air lifted like a heavy stone finally set down. The bride released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to the Apache, her heart swelling with relief, but also fear for his injury. He swayed slightly, and she stepped forward to steady him. His hand brushed hers, warm and worn, filled with gratitude. The leader of the second group knelt beside him, checking the wound carefully. He asked him something again, and the Apache answered in the same calm tone. The leader nodded to the bride, acknowledging her efforts and offering a quiet thank you. She felt her cheeks warm, unused to anyone praising her, especially in front of so many people. The leader explained, in simple words she could understand, that the injured Apache had been carrying a sacred object that belonged to their tribe. It was meant to be delivered safely to their elders. The first group of riders had tried to take it for their own gain, but the Apache refused to surrender it even when wounded. He had chosen to protect something precious, even with danger at his heels. The bride looked at him with growing admiration. She realized he had not stepped forward at the church out of desperation or convenience. He had recognized the cruelty she faced and saw her pain as clearly as he saw his own. His offer to take her hand had not come from a place of taking advantage of her heartbreak. It had come from a place of honor, a decision made by a man who knew what it meant to be abandoned, judged, or hunted. The leader of the second group lifted the Apache onto his horse gently. But before leaving, the Apache reached for the bride's hand. His fingers curled slowly around hers, warm and strong despite the pain. He looked at her with a depth she felt down to her bones. He did not need words. She understood everything in the way his eyes softened and held hers. He wanted her to follow, not out of obligation, because he saw her heart and her strength when the world tried to crush both. For the first time in a long while, she felt chosen, not as a burden, not as a charity, but as someone valued for who she was. The townsfolk watched quietly as she stood there, holding his hand caught between two lives. One filled with gossip and judgment, the other offering a future built on respect and courage. She took a step forward, then another. The Apache's tribe welcomed her with gentle nods. Its thing not her size or the torn wedding dress she still wore, but the bravery and loyalty she had shown. The second group helped them mount another horse. She sat behind the injured Apache, her arms steadying him as he leaned back slightly. The warmth of his trust rested against her chest, and she felt her heart swell with a tenderness she had never known before as they began to ride away from the church. She looked back at the town that had witnessed both her deepest humiliation and her unexpected rising. Some people waved softly. Others watched in quiet wonder. None tried to stop her. Perhaps they finally understood that strength did not always come from a perfect figure or a perfect life. Sometimes it came from surviving heartbreak and still choosing to stand for someone else. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in warm colors. The horses moved in a smooth rhythm, carrying them toward new land, new possibilities. In a future neither of them could have imagined. That morning, the Apache rested against her lightly, trusting her to support him. She lowered her head close to his, whispering that she would help him heal, no matter how long it took. He reached for her hand again, squeezing it gently as if promising she would never face another cruel whisper alone. By the time the stars began to shine, she felt the quiet peace of a new beginning settle in her chest. The old American frontier stretched before them, wide and wild, ready to give them a chance to build a life shaped not by judgment but by respect, courage, loyalty, and love. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly chosen, truly needed, and truly free to write her own ending.